Few books in history have been so widely read, so frequently condemned, and so persistently misunderstood as The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Written in the early 16th century during a time of political chaos, foreign invasions, and fragile city-states, this short treatise continues to unsettle readers, not because it is outdated, but because it remains disturbingly relevant. The Prince does not ask how rulers ought to behave, it asks how they actually do. Machiavelli strips politics of moral decoration and examines power as a practical craft, one governed by fear, loyalty, deception, and necessity rather than virtue alone. In doing so, he commits what was and still is a radical act. He separates political effectiveness from personal goodness. This book is not a celebration of cruelty, nor is it a manual for tyranny in the simplistic sense often attributed to it. Instead, it is a sober analysis of survival in an unforgiving political world. Machiavelli writes for rulers who wish to maintain stability, for states that wish to endure, and for readers willing to confront the uncomfortable reality that good intentions are rarely sufficient to preserve power. Central to The Prince is the tension between appearance and reality. Machiavelli argues that rulers must learn how not to be virtuous, but how to appear virtuous when necessary, and how to abandon virtue when circumstances demand it. Mercy, generosity, honesty, and faith are praised, yet treated as tools rather than absolutes. What matters is not moral purity, but outcomes. What makes The Prince so unsettling is its refusal to flatter human nature. People, Machiavelli observes, are fickle, self-interested, and easily swayed by fear or reward. A wise ruler, therefore, governs not by idealism, but by understanding these tendencies and preparing for them. Power, in this framework, is not evil by default. It is dangerous only when misunderstood. This summary will explore the core ideas of The Prince, the nature of power, the role of fear and love, the limits of morality and politics, and the harsh logic that governs leadership in unstable times. Rather than judging Machiavelli, we will seek to understand him and why his ideas continue to echo in modern politics, leadership, and institutions. If you are interested in books that challenge comfortable illusions and force you to think more clearly about power and human behavior, subscribe to Read and Rise, support the channel, and stay with us as we unpack one of the most provocative political texts ever written. Because understanding power is not about endorsing it, it is about seeing it clearly. First core idea: politics as it is, not as it should be. The first and most fundamental idea in The Prince is Machiavelli's insistence on describing politics as it actually functions, rather than as moral philosophy wishes it to be. This move alone explains much of the controversy surrounding the book. Machiavelli is not interested in ideal rulers governing ideal citizens. He is interested in real rulers governing real people under real pressures. For centuries before Machiavelli, political thought was dominated by ethical ideals. Good government was imagined as an extension of personal virtue. A good ruler was expected to be just, generous, merciful, and honest, and political success was assumed to follow moral goodness. Machiavelli breaks sharply from this tradition. He argues that political reality does not reward virtue consistently, and that rulers who rely solely on moral ideals often lose both power and stability. In Machiavelli's view, the central responsibility of a ruler is not moral perfection, but preservation of the state. A prince who loses power in the name of goodness does not prove his virtue, he proves his failure. Politics, therefore, must be judged by outcomes rather than intentions. What matters is whether a ruler can secure order, defend the state, and maintain authority in a hostile and unpredictable world. This perspective forces a painful distinction between private morality and public responsibility. Machiavelli does not deny the value of ethical behavior in personal life, but he argues that the political sphere operates under different rules. A ruler who always chooses kindness may invite exploitation. A ruler who always tells the truth may be destroyed by those who do not. In such conditions, moral rigidity becomes a liability. What makes this idea especially unsettling is its realism. Machiavelli observes that people are not consistently loyal, grateful, or rational. They respond to fear more reliably than love, and to immediate consequences more than abstract principles. A successful ruler must govern with an accurate understanding of human behavior, not an optimistic one. Importantly, Machiavelli does not advise cruelty for its own sake. He repeatedly emphasizes necessity. Actions that would be immoral in private life may become acceptable, even required, when the survival of the state is at stake. The tragedy in Machiavelli's analysis is not that rulers sometimes act harshly, but that the political world often leaves them no clean choices. This first idea sets the foundation for everything that follows in The Prince. By rejecting idealism as a guide for politics, Machiavelli reframes leadership as a discipline governed by risk, uncertainty, and constraint. Power, once stripped of illusion, appears neither noble nor evil, but dangerously real. From here, the book moves naturally toward a more provocative question. If morality cannot guide rulers reliably, what should replace it? Second core idea: fear, love, and the logic of control. After establishing that politics must be judged by results rather than intentions, Machiavelli turns to a question that has echoed through centuries of political debate. Is it better for a ruler to be loved or feared? His answer is careful, calculated, and often misquoted. Machiavelli does not argue that a ruler should seek fear at all costs, nor does he dismiss love as useless. Instead, he examines both emotions as instruments of stability and asks which one a ruler can rely on when circumstances turn hostile. Love, Machiavelli argues, is fragile. It depends on gratitude, shared interest, and goodwill, qualities that fluctuate with fortune. People love as long as it costs them little. When hardship arrives, loyalty rooted in affection often dissolves. Fear, by contrast, is anchored in the expectation of consequences. It is sustained not by emotion, but by calculation. For Machiavelli, this makes fear more dependable. However, fear must be managed with precision. A ruler who inspires hatred undermines his own authority. Machiavelli draws a sharp distinction between fear and cruelty. Fear is produced by consistent enforcement of laws and consequences. Cruelty is arbitrary, excessive, and ultimately destabilizing. The successful prince ensures obedience without provoking resentment. This distinction reveals Machiavelli's deeper concern with control rather than violence. Power in The Prince is not about domination for its own sake, but about predictability. Subjects tolerate harshness more easily than uncertainty. A ruler who is feared but respected maintains order. A ruler who is loved but weak invites chaos. What unsettles modern readers is not the preference for fear, but the reasoning behind it. Machiavelli treats emotions not as moral experiences, but as political forces. Love and fear are stripped of sentiment and evaluated according to their reliability. This analytical coldness is deliberate. Machiavelli is diagnosing how authority functions, not prescribing how it should feel. Importantly, Machiavelli never advises rulers to abandon love entirely. He acknowledges that the ideal situation is to be both loved and feared. But when the two cannot coexist, and in times of crisis they often cannot, fear becomes the safer foundation of power. This idea reinforces the book's central argument. Leadership is not a moral performance, but a strategic role constrained by human nature. A ruler who ignores this reality does not preserve virtue, he risks collapse. From here, Machiavelli advances towards an even more complex concept, one that replaces moral goodness as the measure of political success. Virtù, the quality that allows a ruler to shape events rather than be crushed by them. Third core idea: virtue, fortune, and the art of control. If morality cannot reliably guide political action, Machiavelli proposes an alternative measure of leadership: virtue. This term is often mistranslated as virtue, but its meaning in The Prince is far more complex. Virtue refers not to moral goodness, but to strength of character, decisiveness, intelligence, and the capacity to shape circumstances rather than submit to them. A ruler with virtue is not necessarily kind or just, but he is effective. He understands timing, adapts quickly to change, and acts boldly when hesitation would invite disaster. Machiavelli admires leaders who seize opportunity, anticipate threats, and impose order on chaos. In this sense, virtue is the opposite of passivity. Opposed to virtue is fortune, chance, the unpredictable forces that shape human affairs. Machiavelli famously compares fortune to a raging river that floods and destroys when uncontained, but can be controlled with preparation and foresight. No ruler can eliminate fortune, but a wise one can limit its damage. This relationship between virtue and fortune defines Machiavelli's political worldview. Success belongs not to the morally pure, but to those who prepare for instability and respond to it with flexibility and force when necessary. Leaders who rely on tradition, routine, or past success often fail when conditions change. Crucially, Machiavelli argues that indecision is more dangerous than error. A ruler who acts decisively and fails can recover. A ruler who hesitates loses authority and invites chaos. In this framework, boldness becomes a political necessity, not a personality trait. What makes this idea unsettling is its rejection of moral consolation. There is no guarantee that good intentions will be rewarded, nor that justice will prevail on its own. Order must be created and maintained through skill, awareness, and sometimes harsh action. Virtue is therefore not a celebration of power, but a recognition of responsibility under uncertainty. This concept also explains Machiavelli's admiration for strong founders and reformers. Those who establish new orders must act against entrenched interests and expectations. In such moments, conventional morality offers little guidance. What matters is whether the ruler can withstand resistance and impose stability. With virtue in place of virtue, the prince advances toward its most controversial implication. If success and stability are the true measures of leadership, then moral consistency becomes negotiable. This leads directly to the next idea: the role of deception, appearance, and the necessity of seeming virtuous rather than being virtuous. Fourth core idea: appearance, deception, and necessary hypocrisy. Having replaced moral virtue with virtù as the standard of political success, Machiavelli confronts a difficult reality. Power is exercised in public, but secured through perception. A ruler is judged not by what he truly is, but by what he appears to be. From this observation emerges one of the most controversial arguments in The Prince, that deception is not a flaw of leadership, but a structural necessity. Machiavelli begins with a simple but unsettling claim: most people judge by appearances rather than by reality. They see outcomes, symbols, and performances, not intentions or inner character. A ruler who relies on sincerity alone exposes himself to manipulation by those who understand this asymmetry. Politics, therefore, becomes a theater in which credibility matters more than authenticity. This does not mean that Machiavelli encourages constant lying or chaos. On the contrary, deception must be disciplined and purposeful. A ruler should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and honest, because these qualities inspire trust and obedience. Yet he must also be ready to abandon them when circumstances demand. The mistake is not deception itself, but being unable to deceive when survival requires it. Machiavelli's reasoning rests on reciprocity. Since others will not hesitate to deceive, a ruler who refuses to do so places himself at a permanent disadvantage. Moral transparency becomes a vulnerability. In this sense, hypocrisy is not presented as corruption, but as adaptation to an environment where sincerity is rarely rewarded. What makes this idea particularly uncomfortable is its clarity. Machiavelli does not frame deception as tragic or regrettable. He treats it as a skill, one that must be mastered, controlled, and applied selectively. The successful prince knows when to honor promises and when breaking them preserves stability. Consistency, in this view, is less valuable than survival. Importantly, Machiavelli draws a boundary that is often ignored by his critics. A ruler must avoid being hated. Deception that protects the state and maintains order is acceptable. Deception that humiliates, exploits excessively, or appears arbitrary erodes legitimacy. The appearance of virtue must be sustained, even if virtue itself is suspended. This idea completes Machiavelli's transformation of leadership from a moral role into a strategic one. Power operates not in a world of truth alone, but in a world of belief. To rule effectively is to manage not only actions, but perceptions. From here, the prince moves toward its final and most provocative implication. If rulers must act against conventional morality, how should they understand evil, and how far can necessity justify it? Fifth core idea: necessity, evil, and the limits of responsibility. In the final movement of The Prince, Machiavelli confronts the question his readers have been circling since the beginning. If rulers must act against conventional morality, how far can necessity justify wrongdoing? Machiavelli does not deny that certain political actions are cruel, deceptive, or morally troubling. What he challenges is the assumption that avoiding such actions is always ethically superior. In unstable political conditions, he argues, refusing to act decisively can produce far greater harm than acting harshly. The true moral failure in his framework is not the use of force, but the collapse of order. This is where Machiavelli's realism becomes most severe. He insists that rulers must learn how not to be good, not because goodness is worthless, but because rigid goodness can be destructive when circumstances demand flexibility. Evil, in The Prince, is not embraced as an ideal, it is tolerated as a consequence of necessity. Crucially, Machiavelli introduces the idea of measured cruelty. Cruelty, when unavoidable, should be swift, controlled, and limited in scope. Prolonged or habitual cruelty breeds hatred and instability. The paradox is striking. Cruelty used sparingly can reduce long-term suffering, while excessive mercy can prolong chaos and bloodshed. This logic reframes political responsibility. A ruler is not accountable for maintaining moral purity, but for preventing disorder. The suffering caused by necessary actions is weighed against the suffering caused by inaction. In this calculation, intentions matter less than consequences. What troubles modern readers is that Machiavelli offers no comforting resolution. There is no moment where politics is redeemed by virtue alone. Leadership remains a burden, not a moral triumph. To rule is to choose between imperfect options under pressure, knowing that some damage is unavoidable. Yet, Machiavelli is not advocating amorality. He repeatedly warns rulers against becoming cruel by habit, dishonest by default, or detached from the realities of their people. Necessity is a justification only when it is real, not when it is convenient. With this final idea, the prince completes its argument. Power is dangerous not because it corrupts morality, but because it forces choices where morality provides no clean answers. This prepares us for the closing reflection of the book and of our summary. Why the prince continues to disturb, provoke, and instruct centuries after it was written, and what it reveals about power in our own time. Conclusion. The prince endures not because it teaches cruelty, but because it refuses illusion. Machiavelli does not invite us to admire power, nor to imitate it blindly. He asks us to look at it without consolation, to understand how authority survives in a world shaped by fear, ambition, uncertainty, and human inconsistency. What makes the book unsettling is precisely what makes it valuable. It dismantles the comforting belief that good intentions naturally lead to good outcomes and replaces it with a harsher insight. Power operates according to its own logic. Conclusion. The prince endures not because it teaches cruelty, but because it refuses illusion. Machiavelli does not invite us to admire power, nor to imitate it blindly. He asks us to look at it without consolation, to understand how authority survives in a world shaped by fear, ambition, uncertainty, and human inconsistency. What makes the book unsettling is precisely what makes it valuable. It dismantles the comforting belief that good intentions naturally lead to good outcomes and replaces it with a harsher insight. Power operates according to its own logic, and ignorance of that logic does not make one virtuous, only vulnerable. Machiavelli's realism forces readers to confront the cost of leadership, the weight of responsibility, and the moral ambiguity that accompanies real decision-making. This is why The Prince should not be read as a manual for tyrants, but as a diagnostic tool for citizens. It teaches us how rulers think, how appearances are constructed, how fear and loyalty are managed, and how necessity is often used to justify harsh choices. To understand Machiavelli is not to endorse him, it is to become less naive about power. Centuries after its publication, The Prince continues to echo in modern politics, corporate leadership, and institutional control. Wherever authority is exercised under pressure, Machiavelli's questions resurface. How much morality can power afford? When does restraint become weakness? And who pays the price for political hesitation? If this kind of reading matters to you, reading that sharpens judgment rather than offering comfort, subscribe to Read and Rise, support the channel, and stay with us as we explore books that challenge easy narratives and expose the mechanics of influence. Because power is most dangerous when it is least understood.